Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
My name's Katie Marie. I'm a horror writer based in the UK. Today I will be reading from my first published novella, Man in Winter. I'm going to start reading from chapter 2. And just for a little bit of context, this chapter starts after the main character, Arthur, has woken up from a horrendous nightmare in which he rescued his wife, Molly, from a home invasion. In the waking world, he did not rescue his wife, Molly, from a home invasion. She actually perished during it before the start of the book. Chapter 2. I was sore when I woke up. It took several long minutes of gentle movement before I could convince my fingers to loosen up enough to let go of Molly's dressing gown, and even longer for me to sit up. The dressing gown was the one she had died in. My hands shook as I let go of it, and it fell to the floor. I thought they had destroyed it. Sophia told me they had thrown it away. What was it doing here? Where had it come from? My bones creaked as I rocked to my feet, and they were still creaking as I shuffled into the kitchen and switched the kettle on. I glanced at the sink and noticed there seemed to be more dishes than I remembered using waiting to be washed. I'll deal with them later. The stiffness had eased a little by the time I reached my living room, tea in hand. I put the tea down on the windowsill and picked up my grabber. Another gift from Sophie that had, much to my annoyance, turned out to be useful. It was a simple device, a stick with a claw on one end that I could operate from the other end. I headed back to the bedroom where the dressing gown was on the floor. The grabber made picking the gown easy. Lord knows without it I would have had to have waited several hours for my back to ease up enough for me to be able to bend down that far. Even then, there was never a guarantee I'd make it back to my feet by myself. I had, until my diagnosis, thought that the worst part of getting old was the fact that I struggled to get up and down by myself. Suffice to say that betrayal of my mind was much worse. The strong possibility that when I passed away, I wouldn't even know who the people at my bedside were was worse than having a bad back. I went back to the living room and stood by the window. Taking my tea in hand, I looked out to the front garden and wondered again how Molly's dressing gown had turned up in my bedroom. You should put hydrangeas in, like we had at the cottage. I almost dropped the dressing gown again as I turned behind me. Molly was sitting on the sofa, relaxed and smiling as if she'd spent the morning sitting there watching me faff about making tea. I always loved hydrangeas, she smiled at me. You should get blue ones. All right, I said, staring at her, my hands shaking. This was another hallucination. I'd had them all the time after Molly died. The medication had stopped them. Had I forgotten to take my pills again? My heart stuttered when I realized I couldn't actually remember the last time I had taken my pills. I bet if you asked Mike, he'd be happy to plant them in for you. To suddenly see her again, so relaxed, not reliving that terrible night, it made my chest tight. She looked alive and happy, chatting to me about flowers. I coughed, trying to shift the lump that had formed in my throat. Art, she said. I looked up, noting that she was wearing her dressing gown, the same one I was holding, but now my hands were empty and the blood was gone from the cloth. Are you all right? Fine, I swallowed. It's really good to see you. Oh, I'm glad you think so, Molly laughed. I haven't had time to tidy myself up yet today. You look beautiful, I said. My vision blurred and I blinked away tears. Oh, you're an old fool. She looked around the living room. I like the new home. When I had had visions of Molly in the past, she had never really interacted with the surrounding world. It was something that Dr. Wakefield had told me to pay attention to help convince me that she wasn't real, that it was my broken mind trying to trick me. But here she was, commenting on my new bungalow. Her weight dented the sofa cushions, and her hair moved in the draft coming from the kitchen. I paused when I noticed that actually something was off. Molly's skin was grey. She was pale, but not the pale of illness. She was actually grey. Molly noticed me staring and put her hand up to her face. You do? I tried to distract her from my staring. Yes, it's small but perfect. It has everything you could need. Sophie spent a lot of time trying to find you somewhere nice and close to her and Mike. I think she did marvelously. Molly beamed at me. How could this be happening? Molly couldn't really be here. It had to be the mist medication. The draft carried with it the smell of her perfume, and I had to close my eyes. Ah, did you hear me? Yep, Sophie's a wonderful kid. I opened my eyes. She takes after her dad taking care of everyone. Molly looked like she wanted to say more, but her smile faded and she looked away as if she couldn't meet my gaze. What is it, sweetheart? I leaned forward, all thoughts of Molly being real or not vanishing for the moment. I knew that look well. Something was upsetting her. Arthur. Something was wrong if she was calling me Arthur. I hate this. I hate that I've tried so hard for so long to get you to see me, but now I'm here. Rather than take a moment to talk, I need you to do something for me. What? I need you to. No, I mean, what's happening? How are you here? Why not? How can you be sure this isn't just my mind? That's a lot of questions. Molly slumped a little, her shoulders dipping. Well, you can't be surprised. No, I suppose not. I'll try to answer them. She took a deep breath. I never left you, Art. My heart stuttered, making my breath catch. I've always been here with you. You just couldn't see me until now. Well, why? Why now? Why not before? I went to reach out but couldn't bring myself to completely close the distance between us. I don't know. I think it might have been the medication that the doctor put you on, but I can't be sure. Just know that I would never leave you willingly, and that's why I need you now. I wanted you to see me sooner, to have time to talk about how much I've missed you, but I can't. Time is running out for me. I need your help. How can I believe this? I turned away. Concentrating, I took several deep breaths and tried to focus on things I knew were real. The view out the window, the cup in my hand, it was smooth and warm. These things were real. I turned back to the sofa, half expecting Molly to be gone, but she wasn't. I don't know what to say to make you believe me. She reached out, offering her hand to me. Putting the cup back on the windowsill, I stepped forward and took her hand. She was cold. Her skin was dry and fragile feeling, like it might come apart under a gentle pressure. I flinched back and let go. Now, I need to take my medication. I turned and headed to the bathroom. My hand shook as I opened the medicine cupboard. The box of pills felt unreasonably heavy when I picked them up. How many had I missed? Did I mean to stop taking them? No, of course not. I popped a capsule out of the foil. Arthur! Molly was behind me. I could see her reflected in the mirror. She looked so real. I had felt her skin under my hand the same way I had felt the cup I'd been holding. Arthur, please don't. I don't have time for you to stop seeing me. I need you now. She was crying. Milky white tears fell down her face. I had made her cry. I was frightening her, trying to abandon her again, just like I had the night she died. I put the pills back into the cupboard. You know I could never say no to you, I said.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Minds of Authors. I am so excited you guys are joining us today. We have an amazing guest. I hope you enjoy the reading as much as I do. And you're probably wondering what's going to happen next, because I am. If you're new to the podcast, go ahead and subscribe. You don't want to miss an episode. If you're interested in bringing these episodes to life and supporting us, you can join our podcast group, become a podcast junkie. The link is at the bottom, so you don't want to miss anything. We're here every week with a brand new author introducing you to an amazing work. So let's get started. Hello, Miss Edie. How are you?
I'm very, very well. Thank you. How are you?
I am thrilled you're here. Thank you for joining us. Happy afternoon from the UK. I'm excited you took some time to chat with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
It is exciting. You introduce yourself as a horror author, and I'm just like, ooh. And this piece you just read us, we're going to talk about it. I want to know, where did this idea come from? And can you tell us more about it?
Certainly. The idea actually came from what I used to do for a living. A few years ago, I used to work in the legal profession. I did it for almost a decade. And I specialized in, among other areas, private client work, which is talking to people about wills, lasting powers of attorney, all sorts of really cheerful things like that. And a lot of the people I was seeing at the time had recently had a diagnosis of dementia, and they were always in the very early stages. Capacity was never an issue because obviously that's very important when you're crafting legal documents for people. But they were all trying to take steps to prepare themselves for what would happen when their illness advanced, but also prepare their families for what would happen when their illness advanced. And they were all so compassionate and so very kind towards the people that they loved. And while they were frightened themselves, obviously, who wouldn't be in that situation, the main thing that they were focused on was the people around them. And I remember walking home one day after seeing such a client, and I'd been seeing people like this for years at this point, and this gentleman just walked into my head. Not literally, that would be weird, but Arthur walked fully formed into my head as a character. I could see him so clearly. This little old man with a dodgy hip, a really unpleasantly bad back, and a secret hip flask in his pocket that isn't secret at all. Everybody knows about it. Oh, it's fine. He literally walked into my head and brought with him all this tragedy about his wife and what had happened to her and his own diagnosis and the progression of his illness. And suddenly he had to save Molly again. He had been given this opportunity that he feels that he failed because, spoiler alert, he was in the hospital getting his hip replaced when the home was invaded and Molly passed. And he's been blaming himself ever since. He thinks that if he'd have been there, even if he hadn't been able to like fight off the intruders as a 70-plus-year-old gentleman with a really bad hip at that point that needed replacing, at least Molly wouldn't have been by herself when it happened. And his whole story is about him basically trying to fix what he sees as his biggest regret before his illness progresses to the point where he will lose his independence. So yes, that's where the story came from and roughly where it's going without too many spoilers.
So you're touching on issues that are so prevalent across the world. Age is something that we all battle and we all try to push it far back as possible, but also the constant fears. Am I going to be independent? Am I not going to be independent? Am I going to lose my mind? So that alone makes it very much like, oh, wow, those are very close to home. What made you decide to write this novella as a horror story?
It was because I've tried to think of the best way to put it, but I've been a writer for a really long time and I have been a horror fanatic for even longer. I've been obsessed with horror since I was like single digits. I blame my mum. She read me stories at bedtime, as some parents do for their children. And my mum didn't read me things like Harry Potter. My mum read me Clive Barker. She read me The Thief of Always. I remember that one really clearly. And dear God, I loved it. It was fantastic. I was like every night running up, we need to read this one again, please. So I've really been interested in horror for a really, really long time. And I like writing. I like writing. I am a writer. And I noticed in the horror genre, particularly mental health, physical disability, things like dementia as well. So illnesses, especially illnesses of the mind, are often portrayed in a certain way, and it's not always a good way. They're either highly victimized, like so vulnerable that they don't have any agency of their own, and they're just basically killed off almost instantly just to show how much of like a threat and how evil the big bad is in the story. Or even worse, they are the big bad themselves. They are the thing to be feared, the thing to run away from. They aren't human, they are the monster. And when I was working with a lot of people who were in the early stages of dementia, they were as far from these things as possible. They still had agency, they were still themselves. They were terrified that people would stop seeing them, that people would only see their illness. And they certainly weren't monsters, they were just people. And I really wanted to write something from the point of view of somebody who was in that situation to try and almost put the humanity back into it again. And Arthur was my chance to do that.
I love how you're taking these topics and bring them back to the light in a way that we can all relate, because you are so right. We have so many times that we read stories or we're looking at even films and TV shows, and everything is this is such a horrible thing, and they're not human anymore. They're
Mm,
become either the victims or the villains, and there's nothing in between. But
yeah.
what if there's something more? So I love this.
There's no nuance to it at all, and it drives me nuts. And hopefully, fingers crossed, I'm hoping, so many fingers crossed. I have like all my fingers and my toes and stuff crossed, but I'm hoping to start my PhD in October. I'm waiting to hear back from the university whether or not I'm going to be allowed to do it. It's like, please, I want to do it. But if I am allowed to do it, if I'm accepted onto the course, I'm hoping to write about, in particular, disability representation in horror and produce a piece of creative work showing how disability should be represented. God, that sounded so arrogant, but I know what I mean. Sort of showing a good way, like plausible, realistic representation, because it's so valuable. We rob people of their humanity so often, and it's tragic. And we are getting better. I'd like to point out it's not all doom and gloom. Not everything is terrible. We are getting better. We do have some better representation these days, but the horror genre in particular is lagging behind in certain aspects.
I don't think it's arrogant at all. You're very passionate and it shows, and you have this desire to help and explain and show to people of something that sometimes we take for granted. And I think it comes back to our fear of aging and our fear of dying. So we
Mm,
make this entire process so monster like, oh my God, this is the end all be all. You're going, it shouldn't be that way. We have some cultures that embrace aging, and the
mm,
elders are treated with such a reverence and so much passion. And sometimes I think some of our cultures have missed it. So we
yeah.
marginalize them and we put them in the corner. We're like, oh my God, we don't want to be that way. It's like, at what point in time did we manage to forget that this is such a natural, beautiful part of our lives and we're all going to get there? Mad props to you for taking on this mission and the passion you bring to it.
Thank you.
I love it.
But
So
yeah, you don't hit like a certain age and suddenly it's like you hit, what was that game? Logan's Run? Something like that, where they had the jewel in the hand and it like lit up and it's like, oh no, my jewel's lighting up. Guess I'm just going to go die now. It's like you don't hit a certain point and suddenly you lose all value. It's crazy that we basically treat people like that.
we have a fear, and that fear reflects back to our society. And then we put people in these categories. So you hit a certain age, there's nothing else you have to add, like you said. And it's like, when did that happen? At what point in time did we stop thinking that we're either too young or too old to add something to the conversation? So this is such a huge topic. What made you decide to do a novella and not do the full novel?
I didn't actually, to start with, make the conscious decision. I just wrote the story as it happened, as it were. I'm usually quite a strict planner, but this one just sort of turned up. There was obviously an element of planning to it. I sort of figured out where I wanted the story to end up, and then I just let it take me there, as it were. And it was as long as it was. When I first tried to sell it, tried to get agent representation for it, tried to get publishers to pick it up, the predominant feedback I was getting was that nobody's going to buy a novella, love. Sorry, they're too short. They don't sell that well. They don't sell well in bookstores because people aren't happy to pay the price for like a book that's so tiny when they can like pay an extra 50p and get like a full length novel. You need to bump this thing up. And I tried, much to my eternal shame. I actually tried. I I added new characters, I had more subplots, I had more character development in some of the side characters. But what actually ended up happening was the focus came away from Art and his story effectively. I tried to involve his family more and develop them. And it just, like I said, it took all the focus away from where I wanted it to be. And the book, when it was a full novel, it felt very disjointed. It felt like I didn't know what kind of story I wanted to tell. And it just didn't work. It was awful. So I decided, no, I'm going to turn it back into a novella. I'd still kept my novella draft. Hooray for me. And hooray for word processors that let you save things. But yeah, so I'd saved that and I decided, yep, that was what it was going to be. I'll try one more time to see if I can get a publisher to pick it up. And if I can't, I will self-publish it myself. And that was the point when Bridget Gate Press sort of rode in to the rescue and said, yeah, we like this story. We'll publish it. And I was so pleased.
Oh, I am so glad. I'm also glad that you went back to your roots and realized I can give this a try. It's not working. It needs to be true to what the story is because so many people will try to go ahead and give in and say what they want to get the story published. I love the fact that you went back. Is there more coming up for art, or are you going, this is a beautiful story. I'm going to move up to other pieces?
All of the stories I write tend to be very self-contained. As you say, you said it very nicely. Thank you. It is basically all done now. And Art Story, if anybody ever picks it up and reads it, it's a very clear ending. It's a very clear stopping point. And I am now moving on to a few other pieces. I don't think I will ever write a series, but I'm never going to say never because you never know. But a lot of the pieces I write are linked by theme rather than story. So I tend to write a lot of stuff that's almost like related by invisible illness. Like dementia is an invisible illness. You don't look at somebody and say, yeah, that person's got dementia. A book that I have that is currently out to Agent, the main character is a alcoholic in that one. And again, you don't look at somebody and say, yeah, look, that person's an alcoholic. The piece I'm drafting at the moment, the main character has anxiety issues and depression. And again, that's not something you can just look at somebody and say, yep, that's that person over there in the corner. They've got anxiety and depression. So I seem to be almost subconsciously linking all of my pieces together through like invisible illness theme or mental health themes.
Have you always been very focused on writing on very social issues? Because while they're all health related, they're very social concepts that we have very bad stigma or confusions about it. And you seem to tackle topics that most authors are like, that's a little too risky. What makes you decide to tackle them on?
Well, I'm going to steal your word. I'm very, very passionate about disability, particularly. I am a chair of where I work, the staff network, the disability staff network. We're called Diverse Abilities. I volunteer for various disability charities in my local area. It's something I have been extremely passionate about for a really long time. And I think when you live and breathe something as a writer, it's only natural that that should come out in your writing. So I think that's probably why a lot of my characters would fall under that heading. But yes, it's also something I have personal experience with myself. I myself am neurodiverse, and I've been, well, again, I'm not trying to turn this into like one of these conversations, but yes, sometimes that can suck because of people's assumptions, because of the way the world is or society is created. I'm a big believer in the social model of disability, which is where people themselves aren't disabled. It's the way society is structured that makes them disabled. And yeah, I think that's probably why a lot of my characters sort of fall into that pool.
It's one of those things that we rarely talk about. And when they're due, they don't give them enough of the respect that they deserve to portray a whole person, not just bits and pieces of what sounds good for the page. So the fact that you're tackling on and you have this understanding and this passion and be able to put it in the page in a way that people can go, oh, that's what that piece was missing. That's what I didn't understand. Because books are amazing about starting conversations. So I love what you're bringing to the table. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned you were working on another piece. Can you give us a little insight on that? Or is that something we can discuss? Because, we're all curious, like, what else are you working on?
Well, like I said, I'm writing something else at the moment. Its working title is The House. And the gimmick in this one, in inverted commas, like the hook, I suppose, is the main character dies in chapter 3. So, yeah. And then the rest of the story is still told from their point of view, but they're dead now.
Okay.
And
for all of our horror fans, this is going to be a fabulous story. We want to hear about it. So I love it. What advice, madam, would you give an up and coming author who's interested in tackling such a challenging topic or any topic? What would you tell them?
First of all, do it. All these topics should be addressed. You shouldn't be frightened to write anything. You need to approach it with empathy and compassion. And above all, you need to do your research. You need to admit, everybody needs to admit that we all make our own assumptions, and assumptions are when we decide an answer based on too little information. And everybody doesn't. We all have unconscious bias. We all make assumptions. and research, talking to people, having empathy and compassion for other human beings, shockingly enough, is how we defeat those. And so if you want to write something about somebody who's very different to yourself, like you, I'm sure the people listening to the podcast can probably guess, but because you can't see me, I'm not a 70-odd-year-old man with dementia, but Arthur is. And the way, like I said, I approached that was with compassion, empathy, by talking to people in Arthur's position. Hopefully none of them are haunted by the ghost of their dead partner, but you never know. So yeah, so do it, have compassion, have empathy, and do a lot of research and try and talk to real people to get their experience.
Great advice to our listeners and anybody interested in doing, whether you're writing, creating any kind of piece. Research is important. Make sure you're talking to people who are there so they can give you a true perspective. And I love the empathy part. Sometimes we forget they're not test subjects in a lab experiment. They're human beings.
No, YouTube's actually a marvelous resource for this kind of thing. Because even if you don't know somebody in your life who, again, to use art as an example, if you don't have a grandparent or a parent who is that age going through that diagnosis or anything like that, go on YouTube. People make videos about everything, and you can get it directly from the people who are experiencing it. So it's not like a documentary where some lovely person from the BBC has turned up in a care home and is like, let's have a brief 2-second interview with this person here. It's actual content made by the people who are living this experience, and it can be really, really valuable. So even if you don't know people, even if you're too shy to reach out or you're not comfortable reaching out, as I know how uncomfortable it can be sometimes, YouTube, man, it's great.
Some of them tell us, where can our listeners find you, where they can learn more about your books, where they can find your stories?
My books are all on Amazon. You can find me on various social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm kind of everywhere. I'm like a disease. I am Katie Marie Wright or Katie Marie Writer. And I have a website, which is www.katiemariewriter.com. Because apparently I have no imagination. So I just put my name in the fact I'm a writer.
We actually appreciate it because they're easy to find.
This is it. Makes it simple.
Yeah, and I don't have to worry how to spell it. I'm like, I know your name. I can find it. Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. But before you leave us, are you ready for the lightning round?
Go for it.
All right. Super easy. Let's see how you do.
Oh, no.
Sweet tea or unsweet?
Unsweet.
You're a brave lady, but we'll do this. Spicy food or sweet?
Sweet.
Okay. Androids or Apple devices?
Oh, Android.
Don't tell anybody. Okay. Indie films or blockbusters?
Oh, no, can I have both? Probably indie, then, I guess. That's not fair. I like both so much.
We'll give you both. You can have both. It's all good.
Thank you.
Here's a little different. Let's see how you do with this one. If you could travel to any time period, where would you go?
Oh, gosh. I would probably not go that far back. I would probably go about 10, 20 years back, and I'd go and find Terry Pratchett and have a conversation with him.
Oh my God, I love it. Awesome.
Terry Pratchett, for those who don't know, is a British fantasy author. He passed away a few years ago from Alzheimer's disease, and it was really sad. But his books are amazing. Read Discworld. It's so good.
You're going to love him. He's amazing. I totally agree. But thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure. Do you have any closing remarks?
Gosh, I suppose just to repeat what I said earlier, if anybody's looking to write anything, do it, but do it with empathy and compassion. And that would be me.
Love it, love it. To our listeners, make sure you go ahead and check out Miss Katie's website, follow her, join her newsletter, continue this amazing journey. If you're new to the podcast, don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss an episode. Make sure you like our episode, review it, share with somebody. We're always better when we're doing together. And we'll see you again next week for another amazing author. Miss Katie, thank you.
Thank you very much.